So I'd like to welcome Cameron Cote. He has been actively involved in Canada's pro-life movement for over 15 years, serving for the last 11 years as, and he has a really long description. It is, as the Western Outreach Director for National Educational Group, or group called Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform. So I don't know how long it took you to learn your title.
We tried to think of something longer. We couldn't come up with anything else, so we were satisfied.
So in that time, he's spoken to thousands of Canadians about life issues. He's the host, and while hosting Canada's largest pro-life podcast, the Prolife Guys, is the name of the podcast, which focuses on equipping pro-lifers to change minds, save lives, and transform our culture. He's excited to be able to share street-tested tools of how to speak with clarity and compassion on end-of-life issues, including euthanasia and assisted suicide. And Cam traveled today from Calgary through the park to give us this presentation. A wife and 2 children, so he's going to be driving back, and I hope not through the park. Yeah, so help me give him a warm welcome.
Thank you, Gwen. Thank you, all of you, for being here, for the parish, for hosting the presentation. I'm excited. I do a lot of workshops. I do a lot of talks within the pro-life movement. It's been a great joy to work with so many people in how to have good, compelling, compassionate conversations about all kinds of life issues. And I'm sure as many of you guys have witnessed, the landscape on euthanasia and assisted suicide has changed dramatically in the last 15 years. Dramatically. I grew up in Victoria, British Columbia, which is a lovely place to live. I went to school at the University of Victoria, and I have a degree in genetics because that's what I thought that I was going to pursue in my professional career. I thought that I was going to be an academic in a dark laboratory, never interacting with anybody about anything, especially not controversial issues. And here I am, having spoken to 10,000 strangers about abortion and several hundred about euthanasia and assisted suicide. And I mention this because while I was at university, I took a number of bioethics courses. And it was interesting that even then, even at a very liberal institution like the University of Victoria, when we talked about assisted suicide and euthanasia in 2009, 2010, and 2011, it was always looked upon as a very terrible and awful thing. There was almost no grace given to somebody like Robert Latimer, who tragically in the mid-1990s perpetuated what is now celebrated in many of our hospitals and medical care centers, euthanizing his young daughter because of profound and perpetual suffering. That the professors who supported abortion, who supported lots of other ethical things that I completely disagree with, even the professors were profoundly against euthanasia and assisted suicide. And yet that has changed dramatically now, where not only are the institutions like our universities very supportive of these terrible injustices, but so many more are as well. Not only our politicians and the media, but dare I say tragically, it is seeping further and further into our church. And I first started thinking more critically about this when I met a fellow named Alex Schadenberg. Has anyone heard of or met Alex Schadenberg before? Alex Schadenberg is the executive director of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition of Canada. I would argue that he is not only the leading expert on euthanasia and assisted suicide in Canada, but I would argue globally. He speaks in legislatures and parliaments around the world talking about not only the slippery slope of assisted suicide and euthanasia, but the terrible outcomes that come for real people like you and I. And initially, he spoke very often about the theory of a slippery slope. And politicians would mock him, saying there's no way that we're going to experience a slippery slope. We have all of these safeguards in place, we have all of these precautions and assurances. And now, he was talking about the threat of assisted suicide and euthanasia. Now he talks about the reality. And while some people aptly will look at Canada as somewhat of a leader in assisted suicide and euthanasia, it's interesting, having spoken to him last weekend while he was speaking at a conference that I was helping to host in Calgary, where he declared that Canada is no longer looked at as a leader in assisted suicide and euthanasia, because most of the nations around the world want nothing to do with what is happening in Canada right now. Canada has become the example of what not to do. Canada has become the example of how do we not give in to the slippery slope? How do we not allow this to spiral out of control in the span of, let's remind ourselves, less than 10 years? The Cote decision in 2015 arguably set this entire political conundrum hurtling downhill as fast as it could. And we're going to get into a little bit of the legislation background, because while I'm sure many of you are very familiar with the legislation that has progressed since 2015, I want to think conceptually. How do we approach this issue? And I'm wondering, has anyone ever had their worldview profoundly impacted by an unexpected book before? Do you have any really big readers here? Anyone been impacted by a book in a way that they hadn't anticipated? In 2012, I participated in an internship with the organization I now work for, CCBR, and I was given this book, Man's Search for Meaning, by Dr. Viktor Frankl. Is anyone familiar with Viktor Frankl? Many people will first and foremost think of him as a Holocaust survivor, having spent both time in Bergen-Belsen and in Auschwitz. But what is often forgotten about him was that even before his time in these killing centers and labor camps of the Nazi regime, that he was a psychologist, he was a neurologist, and he had already been developing a lot of theories in Austria, where he did most of his professional training and clinical application. And he developed what he called logotherapy, which crudely translated into helping people understand the importance of meaning in their life. How vital meaning was, a purpose for how and why they lived their lives in a particular way. And I read this as a naive 22-year-old intern, thinking that this was not going to help my pro-life advocacy at all. That I wanted to be reading apologetics books. I wanted to be reading the best arguments against abortion, against euthanasia, against assisted suicide, and that was all that I needed to be equipped with. I needed to know the arguments. But what this book gave me was an underlying principle that transformed the way that I understood not only the lives of those who are on the margins of our society, but even my own life. Understanding that despair is suffering without meaning. We will all encounter suffering in our lives, but he argued that absent of meaning, absent of a reason or a purpose for how we navigate our lives, it becomes incredibly difficult and unfortunately very unlikely that we will strive through the sufferings that we confront. And he saw this played out shortly after he published one of his most renowned works by being condemned to the labor camps and death camps of Nazi Germany, and observing which men and women chose to die of their own volition and which persevered as long as they possibly could. Tragically, so many died regardless of their will and intent. However, he had very keen observations as to those who put themselves into the, quote, line of fire intentionally, ultimately committing suicide within those death camps, within the labor camps, because they confronted suffering without meaning, without any meaningful purpose in life. And if that was the case for them, then they could not persevere suffering for very long. For some, it would only be a matter of days between their arrival in a death camp and their tragic, ultimately, suicide by staging an escape in which they knew that they would die because they simply wanted what in their minds would be the sweet release of death. Why do I mention this? I mention this because this book changed the way that I understood the euthanasia conversation profoundly. Because we have a beautiful resource in the church. We have sacred scripture, we have our magisterium, we have this book, which I think is phenomenal. I'm sure that some people here are Catholic. I don't know if we have non-Catholics here as well. I think that there's tremendous beauty in a resource like this because it captures not only the rules of the Catholic Church, right? I'm sure that many of you in your place of employment and maybe even your families are somewhat walking on eggshells when thinking about the rules of the Catholic faith. I remember while I was in university, I worked at a Mexican restaurant in Victoria, and I was the only fellow that worked there, and I was also the only Catholic that worked there. When I told my coworkers that I was Catholic, I was hoping that they would ask me about the beautiful traditions of the Catholic Church and the beautiful stained glass windows that we have and all this kind of thing. No, obviously, the questions that they hit me with immediately: why are you against gay marriage? Why don't you think people can have abortions? And why must people suffer? Right? These are the questions that come up so frequently. And I think that the Catechism not only captures very sound logic, but a beautiful evaluation. And I want to start with that to start shaping our understanding of where the Church stands on euthanasia, because this is not something that has been newly developed, right? This is something that has been embraced and accepted by the Church for a very, very long time. And I want to start, there are 3 sections. I want to go through all 3 of them, not because I doubt that you're familiar with your catechism. If you're anything like me, you may be able to be more familiar with your catechism. I certainly should dip into it more than just when I'm prepping for a workshop or a talk, but I want to start with 227, which says, whatever its motives and means, direct euthanasia consists in putting an end to the lives of handicapped, sick, or dying persons. It is morally unacceptable. And so this is how our catechism starts, declaring that this is unacceptable regardless of the motives and means, regardless of whether we do so out of a desire for compassion and empathy, a desire to want to relieve the suffering and pain of those that we love. Because that is a very real concern. I think that as we're approaching these dilemmas of assisted suicide and euthanasia, we have to consider not only the experience of those in the hospital bed, but those that are beside the hospital bed. Have you ever felt completely useless before? Anyone here ever felt completely useless? Many of us, right? And I say that not only because one day we will be, as I'll get into in this workshop, completely useless in the hospital bed. But it is a humbling experience to be perceived to be completely useless beside the hospital bed. And I think of my lovely wife. I am blessed to have 2 wonderful children. My 5-year-old daughter, my daughter Eleanor will turn 5 this week. My son Matthew is 2 years old. I don't know how many of the husbands and men here have stood beside the bed of their spouse delivering a child. I don't know what went through your minds during that experience, but I felt completely useless. Completely useless, especially for our first child, because we had this noble delivery plan of not having any not anesthesia whatsoever, but just like wanting to have it as quote-unquote natural as humanly possible. And so my wife was in this hospital bed, a beautiful hospital bed in Calgary. It was great for like 22 hours. And I was just there like patting her hand, like, honey, you're doing great. Honey, you're doing great. And I just felt completely useless. And I wanted to do something meaningful that would change what my wife was experiencing. Right? And I said that was an air of levity, but that is one of the most handcuffing situations that I've ever been in, knowing that there really wasn't anything that I could do to make this go any faster, make this go any easier in a lot of ways, but that it was still important, and in many ways vitally so. In many ways vitally so, that I was there gently patting her on the hand, saying, honey, you're doing great. Having spoken to multiple mothers who didn't have somebody beside them, patting their hand, having worked in the pro-life movement, talking to thousands of mothers who have either chosen life for their children against the wishes of the father of the children and have been isolated in that scenario, or those choosing abortion as well, that isolation is profound, and that accompaniment is one of the most important things. As useless as I feel being there, my wife has affirmed me over and over again of how useful I was. And so understanding that, but going on to acknowledge that thus an act or omission which of itself or by intention causes death in order to eliminate suffering constitutes a murder gravely contrary to the dignity of the human person and the respect due to the living God. his creator. The error of judgment into which one can fall in good faith does not change the nature of this murderous act, which must always be forbidden and excluded. That there is no splitting of hairs on this, that we need to acknowledge that the intentions matter. The intentions matter, that we can genuinely want to help those with whom we are trying to comfort. We can want to get those through their suffering as quickly as humanly possible, acknowledging the dual component of that, for their sake and for our sake. Because that's something that was very humbling, watching my wife deliver our two beautiful children, is that so much of my anxiety was for my own sake. So much of my own anxiety was me feeling helpless and me wanting to do something so that I didn't feel quite so helpless. And that's a humbling experience for us to encounter. Building on that, the church goes on, though, to offer greater clarity. And I think that so often we only focus on that first part. We only focus on this and we say, okay, well, the church is cold and hard and unaccommodating and doesn't want to help people at the ends of their lives. Because so often this is where things are left. But I do want to go through the other two components that I think give greater clarity. In the discontinuing medical procedures that are burdensome, dangerous, or extraordinary, or disproportional to the expected outcome can be legitimate. This is one of the great things that we're going to talk about, the confusion that's often around euthanasia and suicide. It is the refusal of overzealous treatment. Here one does not will to cause death. One's inability to impede it is merely accepted. The decision should be made by the patient if he or she obviously is competent and able, or if not, by those legally entitled to act for the patient, whose will and legitimate interest must always be respected. Right? A beautiful clarification that there is a profound difference between bringing about the death of somebody and acknowledging our human frailty. Acknowledging the inevitability of our physical death here on earth, and that there's a difference between assisted suicide, the active ending of one's life, the intentional ending of one's life, and the discontinuing or removal of care. Does that make sense, that clarification? I promise that it's going to get more interactive and hopefully more interesting as well as we go, but I just wanted to have this as the ground rules to know where we're coming from. Last one builds upon that even further. The three sections in the Catechism that relate to assisted suicide most profoundly. Even if death is thought imminent, the ordinary care owed to a sick person cannot be legitimately interrupted. The use of painkillers to alleviate the suffering of the dying, even at the risk of shortening their days, can be morally in conformity with human dignity if death is not willed as either an end or a means, but only foreseen and tolerated as inevitable. Palliative care is a special form of disinterested charity. As such, it should be encouraged. So again, a great clarifying of this, that there is profound help, that the church cares. The church cares profoundly how we experience our final days on earth and how we manage and navigate pain. So bearing that in mind, what is the crisis in the church? Why are more and more of our peers, our friends, our family members contemplating assisted suicide, contemplating euthanasia? Well, first of all, I would argue that it's because of confusion. Confusion in a lot of ways made evident so profoundly through the use of language. You'll notice that I haven't talked about medical aid in dying. And I think that's important to recognize, because this is not medical aid in dying. Medical aid in dying is palliative care. The management of pain and suffering in a dignified way that does not intentionally and directly bring about the death of somebody made in God's image and likeness, somebody who's so valuable that while we were yet sinners, Jesus died for us. Like, people who have such profound and important and incredible dignity, there's confusion in language. And that's why I think it's so vital to speak specifically. And I would go even further. I think there's a very important push for euthanasia as a very accurate calling, but even euthanasia in its roots of language means good death. I think that so much of what we need to consider is the fact that this is assisted suicide. Whether a doctor is providing the lethal injection or whatever means of ending life that is presented, or whether that is given by a doctor or a medical professional to ourselves, and we commit the final deed, whatever it may be, I think it's important to think of this through the lens of assisted suicide. Because that changes the way that we understand our final days. It changes the way that other people understand their final days. And to offer that clarity with boldness will often very quickly aid the conversations, because we have an intuitive rejection of suicide. Not only because so many of us have experienced the tragic reality of suicide in our lives, I'm sure many of you have experienced in one way or another the loss of a loved one through the tragic choice of suicide. I have friends who tragically committed suicide. And it is a grappling that is difficult to navigate for anybody. The parents of that person, the friends, the family, the school, to hold some kind of reflection with also having access to suicide prevention is something that we need to have in our minds, because thankfully there is still a deep appreciation for suicide prevention. So one, I would say, is that lack of clarity. We need to provide clarity and avoid that confusion. Second of all, I think that we have, even in the church, the pride of identity that is throughout our culture, right? Certainly outside of the church, there is a profound sense of identity in accomplishment. That so many people will look at, tragically, that equation that Dr. Frankl proposed, despair equals suffering without meaning. And they look at where is meaning in our life. And so often we latch on to temporal meaning. So often we latch on to things that we build into our identity, being the funny person, being the helpful person, being the supportive person. Would any of us characterize ourselves that way? Would any of you characterize yourself as being one of the supportive people in your friend or family group? I'm sure many of you would think of yourselves in that way, and certainly, obviously so, and I would say deservedly so. That we often try to help people, and yet our value is not rooted in our helpfulness. And I think that's something that causes even us as Catholics massive trepidation when we are the ones who are not bedside, but rather bedridden. And we say, I have always been the one who helps. Now I'm the one who has to receive help. And that is a profoundly humbling experience. And while many people look at the deterioration of Western culture as a reluctance of people to offer help, some people will point towards decreased donations, towards different charitable causes. I think in some ways there is a decreased acceptance of help. And I see that across society, whether at the end of life, at the beginning of life, or anywhere in between. That we are reluctant, because of our pride, to receive the help or ask for the help that we need. Having been for so long the one who offers support, the one who brings food, the one who pays the bill at the end of the meal, when we are no longer in that position, we want to isolate ourselves rather than compromise our perception and our identity. So I think that's one of the biggest crises within the church, that we too have this misunderstanding of our identity. That at the end of the day, we are not valuable because of anything that we do or do not do. Right? We don't build the Tower of Babel that we achieve salvation by our own efforts, nor do we garner our own value in any way other than submitting and conforming our will to that of God. And that is incredible, to acknowledge that sometimes the meaning in our life is not as glamorous or as glorious as it was at different parts of our life. The meaning of our lives, as I'm going to circle back to towards the end, is to conform our will to God. Whatever that may be. And I will be the first to admit, I don't know or understand God's will. I apologize, I cannot explain that to you. I hope that's not why you came to the talk today. I don't know why God puts particular burdens in particular individual lives, family lives. I don't know the answer to that. All I know is that our identity and our dignity is magnified and clarified when we conform our will to God. So that the meaning in our life, the purpose in our life, isn't to be the one who brings cookies after church. The meaning, the purpose in our life isn't to be the one who always has the sagest advice or the most helpful and loving hugs. That is not our meaning in life. Our meaning in life is to do what God has laid before us in that day. And finally, there is a competition to our moral compass. So often, when I'm talking to people about abortion, people will say, well, the law shouldn't factor into this. Why do you want to change the law? Just change people's hearts and minds. If you don't want an abortion, don't have one. I think that the law on euthanasia and assisted suicide has demonstrated the point that even for us in the church, our moral compasses are distracted and disoriented by the magnet of cultural law. Right? That very few Catholics would have considered euthanasia or assisted suicide prior to it being legalized. There's very few Catholics seeking out international euthanasia and assisted suicide cause. But now that it's been legalized, we have this extra distraction, this extra pull from an external compass beyond the church. And so we need to understand that, and we need to be able to navigate it. Sound fair? Any questions to this one? Cool. Let's talk a little bit about suicide in Canada. This, I apologize, may be the driest part, because I think, again, we need to bring ourselves up to speed, and then we'll talk about what we can do. Okay, I promise that'll be the action, and we'll all be in time to get home for the football game as well, if you're into that. Let's talk a little bit about the legislation in Canada, in case anyone is not familiar, because I know that not only is this something that we'd rather not think about, but it's also something that we can hear different things from different people, right? That we have people who might be more alarmist or less alarmist than they ought to be. So what is the legislation? Well, first of all, this all really started to spiral out of control in 2015 during the Cote decision that led to the first legalization of assisted suicide in 2016. That legislation was expanded in 2021. Initially, that legislation required death to be reasonably foreseeable, and for most medical practitioners that meant less than 6 months by their professional estimation. You had to have a prognosis that would result in your death to the best estimates in less than 6 months. That was removed in 2021. So your death no longer needs to be reasonably foreseeable. And in 2022, even more alarmingly, they attempted to add mental illness to the list of justifications that could fit for somebody being able to access assisted suicide in Canada, which is horrifying when you consider the fact that the assisted suicide conversation is literally a question of who do you push or who do you pull. What I mean by that is that we have had suicide prevention throughout our culture from time indescribable. We have always had people that have questioned their value, and because of that have been tempted by the allure of suicide. And we've had incredible agencies and entities and individuals who have fought to demonstrate the dignity of that person, even though they may have forgotten it themselves. This legislation sought to expand to include mental illness and suicidal ideation as appropriate justification for assisted suicide. But thankfully, because of the courage of a sufficient number of members of Parliament, that was delayed from 2022 to 2024. They voted on it again in 2024, and they decided to delay it again in 2020 until 2027. And Lord willing, this will be one of the first acts that a new Conservative government will have an election at the very latest next year. Lord willing, somebody other than Justin Trudeau will be in office, and if that's the case, hopefully one of the first action items will be to completely and finally abolish the attempt to expand this for mental illness. And so, what does that look like? So who does qualify right now for assisted suicide? The current legislation, you have to be over the age of 18 currently. That is something that has come under attack. That is something that outside of Canada has been changed more and more. That is something that tragically is starting to slip through in Canada, particularly in Quebec. On the books, at least, you have to be at least 18. You have to be a Canadian citizen or eligible for healthcare. You have to make a voluntary request without outside pressure or introduction. We're going to talk about how blatantly these parameters are often ignored by those in the medical community. Must be chosen with informed consent, knowing that this is going to result in death, knowing that this is not a requirement. This is something that you must have a serious and inevitable or incurable illness, disease, or disability at this point. Even this is getting stretched further and further and further, as we're going to talk about. And second last, must be in an advanced state of irreversible decline, must be enduring intolerable physical or psychological suffering that cannot be alleviated under conditions the patient considers acceptable. And so for some people, they're going to look at this and say, wow, in Canada it's really restrictive. In Canada, there's very few people that actually meet all of those criteria. And yet, imagine this. I'm older than 18, believe it or not. The gray hair is real, I don't add that. I'm older than 18. Let's say that, I'm a Canadian citizen, I'm eligible for funding. Let's say that I decide, because of my condition, that I want assisted suicide. Imagine that I lose one of my fingers in a hobby woodworking accident. My dad is a carpenter. Very few of his very important skills were passed down to me, unfortunately. My mother won all of the battles. My mother is a microbiologist, biochemist. And so there was the battle between the trades and academics, and my mother won on all four of my siblings and my accounts. None of us pursued the trades whatsoever. I'm a liability in most workshops. If I lose one single finger, and I'm over the age of 18, I'm eligible for health care, and I make a voluntary request. You know what? I only have 9 fingers now. This is something that is in an advanced state of irreversible decline. I'm not going to grow another finger. That's not going to happen. And so I am irreversibly decreasing the number of fingers that I have. This is never going to go up again. This is a serious, in my opinion, and incurable disability. You're not adding another finger onto my hand, at least with our current technology. And you know what? Some of you might think that only having 9 fingers isn't that bad. Only having 9 fingers, especially if it was on my left hand, might not be worth saying, but you know what? All of those efforts that you might offer to me, I might deem them to be unacceptable. You know what? The persecution that I experience as a 9-fingered man is unacceptable to me. The fact that some kids will look at my hand while I'm on the bus and ask their parent sitting beside them, why does that guy only have 9 fingers? That is just unendurable to me. I can choose assisted suicide in Canada because I lost one of my fingers. I can choose assisted suicide in Canada because I wear contact lenses. And that is probably never going to get any better. My eyes are probably not going to recover from that shot. There's laser eye surgery. But you know what? I deem that experience to be unacceptable. This is something that is fraught with difficulty, not only because of that, but this notion that it must be voluntarily requested. Is anyone familiar with a MAID team? Many of our hospitals, especially in the larger communities, I know that in Calgary, every single major hospital has what they call a MAID team that goes around advertising medical assistance in dying. They have a little cart, and they'll come into your room, and they'll say, hey, do you know that medical assistance in dying is one of the services that we offer at our hospital? If you're interested, just give us a call. Here's our number. Are we saying that is not outside pressure? Advertising a resource like that? Are we saying that this is something that is chosen voluntarily? Because tragically, though I won't go so far as to say that all of our quote-unquote MAID teams are desperately trying to kill as many people as they humanly can, that our opposition, our opponent, is not necessarily the individual making up the MAID teams, but rather evil forces. I think it bears necessity to acknowledge that there are good people who are used to do very bad things. And as Alex Schadberg was sharing at our conference last week, there are people who the maid team will come in and they'll say, oh, the whole family is here. You know what, I'm just mentioning, we're available, we're going to leave. And then they wait for that family to leave. For that person to be in isolation, that person to be on their own, and then the cart rolls back in. Hey, I didn't want to bother you guys with your family reunion a little bit earlier. Now that you're alone and don't have the support of all of the people who help you remember your dignity, we are going to offer you the great escape. Just so you know, you don't have to suffer anymore. Just so you know, you don't need this pain anymore. And I think that this is something that has, in some ways, infected and so many in our medical community. Tragically, there are good nurses and doctors who, with this, are thinking that there are not enough nurses and doctors. Do we have any nurses or doctors here today? Maybe retired, maybe friends and family who are nurses and doctors. This is something that has been a difficulty, the limitation of time and resources. I have a lot of friends who are nurses and doctors, and it is heartbreaking to hear them talking about how in the time that they dedicated in one room is a minute that they don't dedicate in another room. And so this is a tragic factor in the back of their minds. They might fight diligently against to say, no, I'm never going to try to hasten the death of one person. And yet, when they realize there are not enough beds in their hospital, and there's not enough caregivers in their community, and there's not enough of anything that they want, and that there's somebody sitting in the hallway that could really use this bed. There's somebody who kidney dialysis might get them back out and working. If only they have this kidney dialysis machine for a short period of time. This person, they need the kidney dialysis, but they're not getting any better. That, unfortunately, is something that can impact the work of anyone. Wonderful Catholic, Christian, faithful doctor, nurse, practitioner, whomever they may be. We are, none of us, above reproach when it comes to temptation in thinking that way. Yes?
Our situation in Hinton is we don't have doctors. Hardly.
Okay.
Over 50–60% of people in Hinton don't have a doctor now.
Which I think builds tragically into that so desperately when it comes to, for the doctors who are here, I'm sure they have the best intentions and best faith out there, but when they say, okay, I could either take 100 really easy patients or 10 more complicated, more involved, more complex, more medically demanding patients, that is a difficult thing to not have bouncing in the back of their minds. And I admire and I applaud all those who have fought against that temptation, because that can be difficult, again, talking about the change in our moral compass. When this was not on the table, when this was not allowed, when there weren't maid teams in our hospitals, that probably didn't enter the minds of very many doctors. Maybe that might be something they go home and they complain about, of, you know what, like, this job is so difficult. I just wish that I could help everyone in a noble air, but now it's so much more evident and so much more prominent for our medical professionals. So, as something that we're going to talk all the way through, what is something that we can do? We can pray for our doctors. We can pray for our nurse practitioners. We can pray for all those involved in our medical establishments to ensure that they remain steadfast in their commitment to do no harm. Cool. Let's talk a little bit more about...
I have
yes,
a question.
please.
Is there any pushback for like lawsuits for people, patients being pressured by being teams and doctors?
There are a couple really exciting cases that are happening now in Ontario. And it's difficult because so often these precautions are put in for the safety not of the patient but for the doctor. That the doctor can say, I have 2 signatures, I have a statement from this person, I have everything, this was offered for you, we have the recording in text of everything that was said to this patient. We did not bully them in, we did not say that they were going to be kicked down on the curb if they didn't accept this. And so there are some cases...
Those big teams coming in, I mean, that's so...
Yeah.
Yeah.
So complicating, and yet they've been able to shroud their activity in an air of information. Just like, oh, if you're wanting to proceed with some form of surgery, well, did you know that there's this experimental treatment that might avoid surgery? Just so you know, you don't have to take this other treatment, this experimental thing, but it might avoid surgery. They're arguing under similar pretense. However, the cases that are happening now are first and foremost against mental illness. Because they'll have people saying, you went and you talked to my dad, you talked to my daughter, you talked to my loved one, who is here for psychiatric reasons. They are here, they checked into the hospital because of suicidal ideation. And you had the MAID team go in there within 3 hours of them checking in. How is that ever appropriate? And that is being heard now. There haven't been any cases that have come to full fruition, to my understanding. But it is getting more and more ardent, which thankfully is causing the medical community to start stepping back how bold they have been. But unfortunately, to this point, that's just making them more crafty at times. Because there are some people who don't have the best intentions of their patients, who don't have the best hopes and dreams for everyone having a convenient and good and faithful death. But rather, how many people can we push through this assisted suicide regime to conserve our resources so that we can better help people who are quote-unquote more deserving? And so there's an awful lot of work yet to go, and hopefully some of them will come against the most prominent assisted suicide practitioners, because unfortunately almost every province has what has become known as their euthanasia doctor. The person that is often the second signature. Because as we'll get into, for those who are seeking euthanasia and assisted suicide, they must request it in writing with a witness. That witness, I won't say ironically or interesting, horribly can be their medical professional assigned to them. So this could be the doctor, this could be the nurse that is attending to them, this could be the counselor, this could be anyone in their family. One independent witness and 2 doctors or nurse practitioners have to sign off that yes, this could happen. And so unfortunately there's a number of doctors who, okay, my patient has requested this, I don't know if this is going to go through, you know what, I have an inkling that like this, I think this would be better for them, but I don't think many other doctors would agree with me. Who do I go to? I go to the local euthanasia doctor, who's going to be the second signature on almost every application. And so one of the things that's been talked about in Parliament is limiting the number of applications that you can sign off on. Because there are people who have signed off not only on dozens, but hundreds, and some of whom have signed off on thousands of assisted suicide deaths in Canada already. This has only been legal for less than 10 years, and there are doctors who have already signed off on over 10, not over 10,000, but well over 1,000 assisted suicide and euthanasia deaths. And so these are the parameters that are often given to those with whom death is reasonably foreseeable. Tragically, there is no waiting period. Right? And so for somebody whom a doctor has determined this person's life and death is reasonably foreseeable, the MAID team can come in, assess, okay, you want assisted suicide, I'll send a doctor in. This could happen and has happened in less than 6 hours. A family has been there visiting a loved one and have been notified, not that their loved one would be committing assisted suicide, but that they already have. I left for the day and I came back and my father was dead. No waiting period required whatsoever for a patient whose death is deemed to be reasonably foreseeable. And it's not that much better for those whose lives don't have death being quote-unquote reasonably foreseeable. Again, that doesn't mean a matter of hours or days. That means generally less than 6 months by the best approximation of a doctor. And though I think that it's important to recognize that sometimes those prognoses are very accurate. Right? I think that it's a bit of a mistake that we make in the pro-life movement to suggest that none of these prognoses are accurate. Sometimes when a doctor says that you have 2 weeks to live, you do only have 2 weeks to live. However, tragically, for many of these people, we are eliminating the opportunity for increasing care. My wife's best friend wonderful Catholic, very faithful person, has endured tremendous pressure from the medical community in Victoria because she is 39 years old with advanced cancer. She's been coping with cancer for over 15 years now, and my wife has been back to Victoria 3 times this year because doctors have said, like, no, now is the end. Like this, you have a matter of hours to live. And here we are. In November, this first happened this year in April, happened again in July, happened again in September. Here we are in November, and she was not riding her horse, but walking her horse through meadows all over the place with a very high quality of life because she had the boldness to say no to assisted suicide. She would have been eligible because their prognosis was that you have less than 6 months to live. They've said that for over 2 years now. At some point, it is going to happen tragically, barring divine intervention, which God works in miraculous and wonderful ways. But barring that, Jocelyn tragically will die in the next foreseeable future. However, she has had the courage to not choose that for herself because of the support team available. What about for those for whom death is not reasonably foreseeable? Well, it's pretty similar. It's pretty similar in so much as we need to have proactive or voluntary requests, but those 2 doctors that we're going to sign off now, if they're not an expert in that field, if I apply, if I have lost one of my fingers, and I say, hey, I would like assisted suicide, and okay, well, your death is not reasonably foreseeable, so we're going to have to make this a little bit more rigorous for you to achieve assisted suicide. If my attending medical professionals are not bone specialists or amputee specialists, they have to talk to somebody who is and get that confirmation that yes, my finger will never grow back. Yes, this is a permanent condition. Yes, this is a condition that could result in pain and suffering. And that expert has to help them understand alternative interventions. They have to have a discussion with me about what is available to relieve as much suffering as possible, and that I have to have been deemed, understand, and seriously considered. So this person has to come in, they have to explain to me the support that's available for amputees like me that only have 1 finger left, or 1 finger gone. They have to say, okay, well, this person understood the other options, and they quote-unquote seriously consider. I don't know how you would determine whether or not somebody seriously considered something or not, but that is a quote-unquote safeguard, and there is a 90-day waiting period for them. Though that can be hastened if there's a concern that the patient will lose their capacity to make decisions. So they have to wait 90 days, which is better than no time, right? I think that we do need to acknowledge that the longer the waiting period, the better. As I don't remember who I was talking to before, that some of these restrictions in California, they don't perform euthanasia. You have to self-administer. You can only have assisted suicide, but you have to be the one who performs that final action. And that decreases the number of people who follow through with that initial decision dramatically. We see that in the abortion front as well, that in states like Michigan, where they had a 72-hour waiting period between first consult and actually performing an abortion, the numbers of people that chose not to go through their abortion appointments was a massive difference from all of the surrounding states that had very similar people that didn't have that waiting period. The 90-day waiting period has saved a number of lives, but obviously it's not enough, because there are a number of people who schedule their assisted suicide for the 90th day, and then they're gone. And how tragic it is that there's very little that is done, though not very little that could be done. Okay, so that is a lot of the background. That's a whole lot of information. Any questions before we dive into the proactive, the meaningful, the action items, I suppose? Any questions so far?
And I mean, this might come up in what you do, but is there any things in the church or any support for people who's had loved ones that did this choice?
Yeah. So every diocese will be different, every church will be different, every community will be different. But there is a growing movement of networks across Canada and around the world to support those grieving for that, because this is something that needs support. That whether it was done through euthanasia assisted suicide for anyone who loses a loved one. There needs to be grieving support for them, but especially oriented towards somebody who has chosen this. This is something that is hurting a lot of families because there are people like us who want to help our loved ones not choose assisted suicide, but they do so anyways. And it is really difficult to not fall into despair ourselves and we say, well, what did I do wrong? Why wasn't I able to show them that their life was worth living? Why wasn't I able to help? Why did this person reject me? I'm currently reading a book by G.K. Chesterton, his book called Orthodoxy, in which he talks about the profound act of suicide and how it is the exact opposite of murder. Where murder is one person saying, I don't want this one person. Where suicide is one person saying, I don't want any of humanity. It is a profound rejection of everyone else around. Though that is often not the conscious or stated case, that is a very real experience for so many of us when a friend of ours, whether a 15-year-old otherwise healthy person or somebody in advanced stages of cancer or any other health condition, chooses assisted suicide, euthanasia, anything that results in the intentional ending of their life, is a profound rejection of ourselves. And we ask, well, why did they ask for help? Or when did they ask for help and I didn't give them help? This is something that is growing. I know that the Archdiocese of Edmonton, as I'll get to at the very end, has a growing community about support in this area. But it's something that I think can and should happen at every church level, at every individual church, in every family. Because for some people, they don't know how to take that step out and to go to that anonymous support group or to reach out to somebody or call a 1-800 number. That can be daunting. And so we want to build this proactively. That's why we do presentations like this, to be proactive in our development of ministries and action items so that people know that that support's available and we are more acquainted with what each other are going through. Because some of us here might have a loved one in a hospital that is considering assisted suicide. And nobody else here might know about that. Maybe nobody else knows about that loved one. Maybe they're an distant relative, a friend from school, a friend from anywhere. And we cannot and should not suffer alone. And so there are networks that are growing there. The Archdiocese of Edmonton has done a really exciting and very encouraging job of building up greater awareness around that. But I think that if there isn't something like that in the church already, that could absolutely be an action item to think about. Yes?
Where does the DNR factor into all of this?
The DNR, I'm glad that you mentioned that because that goes back to one of the areas of confusion. That when we think about what can we do, we need to protect ourselves. And so often we want to take a simple step that is a statement. I don't want assisted suicide euthanasia. And a lot of people conflate that with a do not resuscitate order. They don't know the difference between the two of them. But as we heard in that second section from the Catechism, it is morally appropriate to have a do not resuscitate order. That under particular circumstances and situations, I don't want medical intervention to extend my life. And there's a significant difference between that and desiring intervention that will hasten my death or bring about my death. And so those are two very different things, and I think that there are different complications that go into each of them. What is motivating a do not resuscitate order? Though they may be appropriate, there are times they may be inappropriate. If the intentions of why resuscitation is not requested or requested against may be there, I think we need to evaluate our own intentions as to why don't we want to be resuscitated. If it's motivated by a desire to die, then that might not be appropriate. If it's motivated by an acceptance of an inevitable death, that may be very morally acceptable. I don't know if that quite answers the question, but I think there's a really important difference between the two of them. And that does kind of play towards how big this can be. So does that kind of answer the question?
It's kind of a slippery slope, you know?
Yeah.
It's how you use the DNR.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. I think that thankfully most medical professionals will, because it is a legally binding document, will acknowledge that there's a difference between not proceeding with medical intervention and actively hastening. But even then, I think that sometimes the confusion comes into what is ordinary and what is extraordinary. Is that we're familiar with those two terms of ordinary care and extraordinary care. Those, in some ways, are becoming less and less meaningful. Because what is ordinary care?
Wouldn't ordinary care be like warmth, comfort?
Food. Yes.
But even food at some point
Yeah.
in the thing you can't take.
Antibiotics that would keep.
That's extraordinary, you don't need to take that.
And so that's why it can get really difficult, because in some cases, food is extraordinary when it comes to how it's delivered. And so there are people, and this is why I think clarity is so important, because I have given presentations like this and had people give a massive sigh of relief in the middle of a presentation that I have no idea what it's about until they come and approach me afterwards and they say, I thought my loved one chose assisted suicide, and I guess they didn't. Because they were intubated for food. And they declined that because of how much pain the intubation was causing them, that they had their feeding tube removed. And tragically, they died through the natural course of their bodies ceasing to function in a coordinated way. And the person thought they had committed assisted suicide. And I've even had one case, speaking with a woman in Winnipeg, where the priest thought that they had committed assisted suicide and was unwilling to perform a Catholic funeral. And that clarification that there are moral and appropriate ways of not only removing care that might even be deemed what would have conventionally been ordinary. We think about temperature control and comfort. We think about food and oxygen. And yet, in so many ways, intubation and an iron lung, though providing basic essentials of life, may be very extraordinary in their care. And so that's why it's more a matter of, is our intervention actively and directly and intentionally ultimately bringing about death? Or is it simply removing the inevitable prevention of death kind of thing? And so having that clarity can be tremendously helpful, especially, like I said, for those people who thought one way or another about a loved one, because it's difficult to not have a judgmental heart towards a loved one who chooses what may or may not be assisted suicide. It can be hard, even for somebody who doesn't do so in a medical situation. That is something, not to go too far in depth, but I had a friend 1 year older in high school who tragically committed suicide. And that was something that they wanted to walk through with all of us students to make sure that we understood that we were not culpable for our friend's death, and that this was not something that was a burden on each of us. This was not something that we should feel guilty about, though it is something that we should be more aware of and more sensitive towards, and more cognizant of, so that we can better engage those that might be asking for help, though we don't know it. And so it can be a slippery slope, the confusion, even related to that, I'll just do that aside as well, pain management as well. The question as to how much pain alleviation can you receive? Because, as we saw in 2279 of the Catechism, you can actually receive pain medication, even pain medication which might result in complete sedation, that might even time-wise shorten that person's life. If they didn't have any pain medication, their natural life might have even lasted longer, provided the intentions of both the recipient and the doctor advising on it were not to intentionally kill the person, but rather to most effectively manage the pain. I don't know the intentions of people. I can't say whether or not the person in front of me had the intentions of managing their pain or bringing about their death. That is something impossible for me to discern, and something that I would argue that only God can know the hearts of each of us. That isn't to say necessarily that every person who chooses assisted suicide did so not intending suicide. Right? That isn't to say that everybody had the best intentions, but rather simply that I can't know them, particularly when it comes to pain intervention and removal of life-prolonging care.
So it's complicated.
It's complicated. It's complicated. And that's why the most important thing that we can do to protect ourselves, I'm sure some of you have seen or heard about the Do Not Euthanize Me cards. I don't know if anyone has one of those in their wallets. I know one of the ladies in my parish actually has the tattoo on her arm that says, "Do not euthanize me," which I think is the first small step. The first small step. Though often it is not sufficient. Right? If I have one of those in my wallet, and the doctor goes to my wallet and says, "Oh, he's got a Do Not Euthanize Me card in here," but I look that doctor in the eye and say, "Please euthanize me," and he deems that I am of sound mind, he's going to euthanize me. Right? The card only goes so far. The card will help if I am in a coma from a car accident and I don't have a do not resuscitate, and so they say, "Okay, well, we're going to resuscitate this guy, and we're not going to proceed with euthanasia or assisted suicide because he's made that clear in his wallet." But when we think about those who are receiving assisted suicide, very few of them are in that situation. So what I would argue the most important and most vulnerable thing that we can do is make our intentions known to those who are going to be in the room. And not just send out that mass email to all of our children or our friends or our family, "Just so you know, I don't want to be euthanized." Because that might not come through. You need to empower the people who will empower you. What I mean by that is that there are going to be dark and difficult times for each of us towards the end of our lives. I pray daily for a happy death. I pray that this will not be an arduous and prolonged encounter. I have no idea if that prayer will be granted. I may find myself in tragic and profound suffering, and in that time I may be severely shaken in my resolve. I think that at times we as Catholics are too confident in our abilities, our willpower, our theological formation. I was reflecting, preparing for this talk, on 1 Peter chapter 5, the last chapter of the letter of St. Peter that was written to leaders in Rome, that talks about how our opponent, the devil, is prowling like a lion, looking for someone to devour. So often that happens in our weakest moments. The devil is waiting for us at our weakest. And it goes on to say that all of our brothers will be faced with this suffering as well. And that we need to not only prepare ourselves to be as virtuous as we can, I would encourage you to talk to your loved ones and explain to them why. Why don't you want assisted suicide? Why may you need their help in holding fast to that commitment? Because in a vulnerable way, I have a loved one who was severely tempted by assisted suicide. A number of years ago, my grandmother was in hospital. She had always been the most helpful person in her community. She worked for St. Vincent de Paul for a long, long time. She was super active. She was a steward at the cathedral, so active. And I went in to visit her, and it was the most terrifying moment of my life, because she lunged at me from her hospital bed and said, "Cameron, make it stop. Stop them from doing this to me, just make it end." And it was like literally one of the jump scares that you see in a movie. And she just launched herself off of this bed, "Cameron, make them stop." And thankfully my dad was there. My dad is a wonderful man. And he was able to empower her, because she had empowered him first. "No, Granny, we're going to go through this." My grandmother's still alive. We're well over 10, assisted suicide wasn't even legal at the time. It was well over 10 years ago. And she was just in such a vulnerable moment. She was in such excruciating pain that she just wanted to end it. We may find ourselves in those situations. And if we do, we need to have people around us that are going to help us. Help us make those hard decisions. Help us stay steadfast to our faith. Help us remain resolute in our understanding of our own dignity and our own value. And so have those hard conversations. Fill out that piece of paper, put it in your wallet, tattoo it on your arm, do all that kind of stuff. That can help. Even more helpful, make sure that everybody who may be in that room knows that they need to help you get across that finish line well. That they need to help you. And second, we need to help others, right? That's be the first step for each of us, to have those vulnerable conversations and say, hey, there may be a time when I don't want to stay true to this. There may be a time when I don't want to go through with whatever pain and suffering the Lord has in store for me. We're going to talk about inspiration at the end of this presentation. But to be able to have that proactively with our loved ones, maybe even with our family members who might not be part of the faith anymore. Maybe your children have stepped away from the faith. Maybe they no longer identify with, no, mom or dad, they're a Catholic, and I'm going to make sure that their Catholic faith is upheld through the rest of their life. Maybe they are going to be predisposed to being a little bit like me and tapping my wife on the hand during the delivery of our child and just want to do something that puts themselves out of that situation. Have that hard conversation with them so that they know their duty. Whether that they are going to help you do what needs to be done. Back to other people, we need to be bold. We need to be charitable, but we need to be bold in communicating their value. And their value outside of what they do. Right? That when we think about the despair equals suffering without meaning. When we think about somebody who is standing on the ledge of the bridge, not knowing if they're going to jump or not jump, how do we help them? Well, in the moment, the meaning that we help give them might be temporal. Right? We might talk to that person on the bridge, or we might talk to that person in the hospital bed and explain, like, oh, well, what about your kids? What about, your son, your daughter, they're about to graduate. Can we hang on for them? Can we hang on for this? Can we hang on for that? And some people only get suicide assistance, and we've established 2 tiers of people. Some whose lives are worth living and some whose lives are not worth living. And who are we to decide upon that? If they say, okay, well, I guess no lives are worth living then to be able to demonstrate not only the moral reflex, but also that fact that there is somebody that ought to get suicide prevention. And maybe even we are grasping at straws and say, wouldn't it be a better world? If you don't believe in eternal bliss in heaven or anything like that, wouldn't our world just be a little bit brighter if we actually had it? Maybe it's unnecessarily so. Maybe we take Pascal's wager and there is no heaven and there is no glorious reward. There is no benefit from being virtuous and conforming to God's will. But what if we lost? What if we lost in acting as though people were valuable? And yet for some people, that might resonate theoretically. But practice is so much different than theoretical. And so how do we inspire people? Well, as Catholics, we can draw inspiration not only from our Lord, not only from the Blessed Mother, but I often think about the saints and our church fathers. And the difference between those who held on until the end and those who didn't. My now wife, gave me this great book about St. Francis Xavier. Is anyone familiar with the story of St. Francis Xavier traveling from Portugal to India and converting tens of thousands to be one of the greatest apostles? People like St. Paul, who made tremendous sacrifices and went so far and died for their faith. Martyrs who died for their faith, and how the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. I mentioned at the beginning that there's books that have shaped my life. This was one of the books that shaped my life. For those of you whose children might be looking for a spouse and whatnot, or those of you here who might be looking for a spouse, don't give them a book about a really awesome priest. My wife did that before we were dating, and we almost never dated. I read this book. I love St. Francis. It's great. My co-worker, Stephanie Gray-Carn, some of you might be familiar with the name, might have met her. She was the co-founder of CCBR. She wanted to get each of us staff members Christmas presents, and she wanted to buy a book for each of us. And so I told her that I really enjoyed this book, and she went on Amazon to find similar books. Amazon doesn't have great algorithms, so she got a book about a Japanese priest who apostatized before his death. And I'm reading this whole thing. I have no idea what it's about. I'm reading it. It's great. He's getting tortured, and all these people are admiring him, and all this great stuff. And then he apostatizes and rejects the faith. And the last chapter is him walking around no longer as a priest. And how this massive flock that he had garnered through all of these ups and downs and suffering and everything, they all walked away from the faith. And, I mean, Japan has had a long and difficult history when it comes to missionaries, and it's many beautiful stories, many saddening stories. But we look at that, and we say, okay, what is the value of a witness that you run the good race, you fight the good fight, and you get to the end, rather than fighting so hard and so diligently and not getting to the end, and not getting across the finish line. And though assisted suicide is not identical, obviously, to apostatizing our faith, in some ways it does undermine so much of what we believe and what we call others to believe. And so we need more people who are willing and able to not only virtuously strive for that, but we need to help each other achieve that. That nobody gets to the end of the race on their own. We need each other to be able to get there, because anyone who has competed in sports or run marathons or races or anything like that, like there's lots of times that you want to give up. Lots of times that you want to give up. And that's something that we can communicate to our secular people as well. That you don't need to be religious to appreciate the value and benefit of fighting the good fight. That whether you were inspired by the deeds of the martyrs who died for their faith and kept faithful to the last, or whether you look at somebody like Viktor Frankl, who strived for meaning and purpose in his life and encouraged others to do so, sometimes from temporal to temporal to temporal to temporal, finding more things to give meaning and more things to give value. We appreciate, we value people who don't give up. We respect that profoundly in people. And what is more important to get to the end of the race faithfully in a part of our lives? Right? That this is so much greater than any race that we can ever run for any kind of cause. Yes, you want to get to the end of your 10K or your marathon or your 5K or whatever racing you're at kind of thing. This is so much more important than that. And if we try to instill these principles in our children, in our loved ones, in our friends, our families, our neighbors, how important it is to be dedicated towards completion of tasks in a meaningful way. What greater lesson, what greater application than in our own lives? And so I hope and I pray that we can not only build that spirit around us, that we can be strengthened in our faith, but that we can bring that to other people, hopefully using some of those conversation skills to understand and empathize where people are at, to demonstrate the fact that all people must be treated equally, that it's not fair, not appropriate to undermine people's value by suggesting that they aren't worthy of suicide prevention, and that if they are worthy of equality, then their value is demonstrated through our moral reflex and through the understanding that at least somebody should receive this, and everyone should receive the same kind of treatment, even if it's difficult to prove eternal life. Pascal's wager is still worth taking. So that's what I wanted to share. I'd love to invite any questions you might have, because not only did I cover a ton of content, but I'm sure there's a few things that were not as clear as they ought to have been.
I heard recently in BC that there was a lady who had called a suicide prevention line, and she was referred to the MAID program. Is that true?
That is true. That is true.
Is that legal? So
the argument was that they were just explaining the opportunities available, and that I know of the specific case, and that though they called the suicide prevention line, the doctors who ended up administering that assisted suicide did so under the pretense not of mental health and suicidal ideation, but rather underlying health conditions that may have led towards that. And so the fact that mental illness is not included currently doesn't mean that it's not a factor. There's a number of people who have gone through very similar cases where they've been admitted to a hospital because of suicidal ideation. They've called suicide prevention lines. They have learned of the resources and quote-unquote supports available to them on their underlying, because as often is the case for suicide prevention, they're trying to understand what is motivating this. Oh, well, you're motivated by an underlying health condition. Me as an amateur or not a dedicated expert in this particular field, I can suggest that you know that there's this other option on that condition. If it's just suicide, if it's just mental illness, then I'll help you, but this is an example of a two-tiered understanding of value.
So suicide prevention lines are really not safe?
Some of them aren't.
That's scary.
What I will say, my last slide on here,
That's scary.
is resources. So I have had the pleasure of working with Alex Shattenberg from the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition of Canada. Not only is he one of the kindest and most engaging men that I've ever known, I did a whole podcast with him called The Art of Human Connection, because he's one of the most interesting people that I've ever met. He is also the most accessible person that I've ever met. What I mean by that is that I'm pretty sure that it's a direct line to his phone on his website. I have called him on several occasions. Alex, I don't know what to do. This is what's happening to a friend of mine. This is what's happening to a supporter of ours at CCBR. This is what's happening. What needs to be done? What can you do? And he gives his phone number out to anybody.
What's his last name?
Shattenberg. S-C-H-A-D-E-N-B-E-R. Alex Shattenberg. I'll email several of these resources. The Hope and Dignity website that I mentioned earlier from the Archdiocese of Edmonton is a phenomenal resource and a growing network of support, not only proactively to prevent assisted suicide, but also in growing ways to support those who have lost loved ones through assisted suicide. Make Time for Life. For a while, I was the president of the board of Life Canada, and they developed this great Make Time for Life Dying Healed program that equips people with more comprehensive tools to proactively engage people in seniors' homes, hospitals, hospice care, palliative care facilities to ensure that they are reminded of their dignity and reminded of the importance of a truly dignified and natural death. And the Care Not Kill program by ARPA Canada is a petitionary legislative initiative working to communicate to our members of parliament that we don't need more assisted suicide. What we need, if anything, is more palliative care and more support in palliative care, more awareness towards palliative care. This idea that many people are fearful of pain and suffering at the end of their life, whereas many palliative care nurses and doctors will acknowledge that though suffering is more than just pain, more than just physiological pain, that not only is pain management incredibly comprehensive now, but also the amount of emotional, spiritual, and psychological support available to all those through the palliative care system has been growing in leaps and bounds as well. Yes?
One more thing. I had gone to a group and somebody had pointed out that it had just become, I believe, legal in Quebec about ordaining in your will made. Was there something that became legal in Quebec regarding your directions in your will?
So Quebec has been at the leading front of basically everything for suicide euthanasia, so that doesn't significantly surprise me. I don't know the particulars as to what you're building into your will, apart from I know that you can give an advance directive on euthanasia. Should I find myself in this condition or experiencing this medical predicament, I would like to be euthanized. And it doesn't even necessarily need to be, in my understanding, at an advanced stage. I know of at least one case where it was said, if it is determined that I have dementia, I don't want to wait until late stage dementia, just proceed with assisted suicide. If I'm somehow not in a capacity to request it right now, know that I desire it, sort of thing. So unfortunately, Quebec has been at the leading edge of it. I know they have been fighting to try to get mature minors access to assisted suicide and euthanasia as well, which is horrifying, and have been drawing from some of the European nations like the Netherlands and Belgium on proxy decision-making for minors as well. So, yeah. Yes?
If you have something specifically written in your personal directive that says you do not want to be euthanized, does that protect you?
So it can protect you, but it doesn't necessarily protect you. in that if you cannot give consent with capacity for assisted suicide, then that will be the holding directive. However, if you have the capacity to modify that directive, then the doctor will go with whatever capacity, with whatever you say most recently, as it were. And the guidelines around capacity are fuzzy at times. Who is capable of saying that they want to die? Doesn't that implicitly suggest that they're not in the right mind to protect themselves and make the best decisions for their life? I feel like that's a self-defeating kind of argument, but that might be beyond the scope of this. If they deem, okay, this person has the capacity to make medical decisions, you can have, do not euthanize, be tattooed as many times as you want on your body. They're still going to listen to your request. And so it is helpful, it is valuable to have, but it's not an absolute bind.
Sure that in ours we put one of our daughters to speak for us when we could not speak, that this would not be, we would not want any assistance inside. So does that?
So that helps.
Yeah.
But again, if a doctor deems, okay, you are capable and you're in a different spot than you ever thought that you would be in, and you request at that point, then that will override. Also, and that speaks to the importance of talking in depth with that loved one, that to say, hey, I don't want to do this. It's not a fair analogy, but it was kind of like the birth plans that you make in your naivety at times. My wife saying that she didn't want an epidural, and like she told me like don't let me get an epidural, and I was like, okay, well, I will make sure that you don't get an epidural. And then like 18 hours into labor, she was like, no, I want the epidural. Like, there was nothing that I could do to stop her from having the epidural. I would have been an advocate for the epidural a lot earlier. But that kind of thing, that making sure they're in the best position possible, because my wife can choose the epidural at any point, but also if my wife was incapacitated and I've been empowered, she can tell me a million times over, but I'm a weak, tempted human being as well. If I look at my wife and I say, no, we're doing the epidural, whether I convince myself that I'm doing it for her sake or for my sake is a difficult burden to put on somebody without sufficient discussion.
So like we say, no matter how much pain I'm in and whatever, go with this.
Yeah, so that, but then also help me go with this, right? Because if you have lost your capacity to make a decision, then that gets a little bit easier for them. If they say like, no, my mom told me resolutely that this is what she wants done, okay, I just need to stay steadfast. But if my mom still has capacity and she's changing her will there, I want to be empowered to say, no, Mom, I'm going to work to change your mind. I am going to try to change your desire because you asked me to try to change your desire. You never thought that you would change it of your own volition. You never thought that you would support assisted suicide, but now that you do, you have tasked me with the obligation of trying to change your mind back, to try to make sure that you don't receive assisted suicide. And that's a far heavier burden and requires a far deeper understanding than others. Yes?
And what is the name of your little book there that you said made so much?
Oh, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. You can buy it at Chapters or Amazon. Don't buy it on Amazon if you have a local bookstore. I bought like 40 copies of them and gave them out to everybody for Christmas, which was probably like the most depressing Christmas gift because like the first 3/4 of it is his experience in Auschwitz, and I mean it's beautiful, it's great, like not really the book that you want to dig into right after Christmas kind of thing, but I would highly recommend it.
I just want to share that some of us will be taking it off the program, and yesterday we had our retreat, and this one testimony on the video just struck me so deeply, and it makes me think of this, in that this man had many addictions, you know, but his uncle gave him a book because he loved to read. Well, this book happened to be the Bible, you know, and he met Jesus, and he had an experience with Jesus and gave his life to him, and the next morning he said, I was set free. I had no more addictions. You know, I was a new man, and I just think like our faith is so integral in this. You know, like it's almost like it has to go hand in hand. You know, like there's so much power in that. You know, to journey with somebody or to witness with somebody. Yeah.
And to identify with Christ in the agony in the garden. I think that's one of, again, I don't want this to be too Catholic, because I don't know if everyone here is Catholic, but like I think that's one of the great gifts of the Catholic Church, to be able to reflect on the lives of the saints. Because it can be tempting, even for us as Catholics, to somehow separate ourselves from Christ and borderline fall into the heresy of like, but Christ was divine. Like, Christ could have sinned, but could not have sinned. Like, I have a hard time in some ways identifying with Christ because of his divinity. I have a hard time identifying with the Blessed Virgin because of her Immaculate Conception. I have an easier time identifying with St. Paul because of his frailty. Not that I'm anything like him, but like I think that's one of the beautiful gifts that we have in the faith, to be able to reflect upon the lives of saints and find saints that have navigated such similar roads that we have, and to have that faith anchored in our hearts that can drive us through very, very difficult roads. Yeah. Yes.
I think one of the things is, as a society, we have basically been taught that suffering is evil and should be avoided at all costs.
Yeah.
Whereas Catholics, we believe in the value of redemptive suffering.
Yeah.
And so I think if we can help people to understand that their suffering actually has a value, that can change their perspective.
You know, the tourist.
Back to Victor Frankl. And back to that depth of eternal meaning rather than just temporal. That not only does our suffering have meaning in our participation in the cross, but also that our lives have meaning when it comes to our obedience and participation in God's will, kind of thing, whether we suffer or not. Yes?
So I think I got from this whole thing is we have no surefire way of guaranteeing that in any condition that I'm in that I would not be put down. Mm-hmm. The only way is by family support. Is that what I'm hearing? Like there's no physical writing that I can do or...
So, in some ways, yes, because, so you can put in physical writing, this will never happen to you without your consent, right? Yeah. What I'm saying is that unless you are a far stronger man than I am, or
which I'm not,
then there's no guaranteeing that your mind won't be changed.
Right. And so I have to rely on the support of my family that I've chosen to tell them, you got to change my mind somehow. Yeah. That's the only solidity that I have.
I think that's the biggest way. I think, so I would argue that in some ways there's two, right? That in that if we could make it illegal again in Canada, then no doctor would be able to perform assisted suicide in euthanasia as well. And yet in that, with it being legal, that barring us individually never choosing assisted suicide, if you don't choose assisted suicide, I am confident that it will not happen to any of us if we don't actively choose it. But in some ways, this is a matter of, can I guarantee that you won't lose your faith? I can give you the strongest arguments in defense of your faith for why you should never lose your faith. But at the end of the day, we could each lose our faith at some point. None of us here, hopefully, are in that crossroads of, maybe I'm going to walk away from the Catholic Church, but I cannot prevent you from leaving the Catholic Church. Right. Whereas, how do we make sure that somebody doesn't leave the Catholic Church or something like that? We arm ourselves with the strongest arguments against it so that I never want to. And I surround myself with people who will hold me accountable and help me to not do that. So that's, I wish that I had a better answer. I wish that there was a way that you could state firmly enough that even if one day you asked for it, it would not be given to you. But unfortunately, that's not where we're at with the legislation in Canada.
So we do what we can. We write our euthanize, and we have our family, we have our community.
Yes.
And then we have to have our faith and trust in the Lord, like we say the rosary now, that's the hour of our death. So Yeah, that's our intent of our heart. We have to trust that God will help us with that.
And pray for the specific grace.
That's right, and that's what we do for Para.
I just want to add that we need to pray for our medical system because
Yes.
what's scary is that down the road, we may not have a choice.
Yeah.
And not because, but the beds are running out, the doctors are scared, like there may not be palliative care available for us. It doesn't matter what you tell your kids or what you have in your written, but that's what's scary for me.
So
is
we
where
pray.
we're going.
We can pray.
That came up the other day in the conversation that we are where we are right now, and down the road it could be mandatory anyway.
Yeah. But we
If
pray
we
to
don't
us.
take action.
If I could say one more bold thing, be okay being a burden. What I mean by that is, so I had a really awkward conversation with my in-laws about, we live in Calgary, they live in Victoria. I don't even know how it came up, but I just straight up told them, if you guys are in this situation, I want you to move in with us. I want you to become a burden on us, and I don't want you to deny the fact that you are a burden. Because it's okay to be a burden. I think that obviously this motivates a lot of requests for assisted suicide, that I don't want to be a burden on those around me. I want people to be a burden on me. I want people to trust me to care for them when they can't care for themselves. I want an interconnected and interreliant community, and not this idea that I can't ask for help and I can't receive help from anybody else. I want people to be okay being a burden. So let's not pretend that they're not burdens. Let's not pretend that if my in-laws or my parents live in our basement and need us to give them everything and spoon feed them, that somehow is not a burden.
That it's a blessing.
It's a blessing. And even if it is a burden, it's a burden worth bearing. So.
Wonderful word to end with, and so, yeah, I appreciate that. I appreciate the resources that we can connect with, because we're moving to a new phase in our history of the world. We need those. I appreciate that you're fighting a good fight to stand for life and against death, the culture of death. So keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll hang out. We have a table over there if you'd like to check on our books. We have a few books, including a much further expanded and far more eloquent explanation of how to discuss assisted suicide and other books. And then if you'd like to fill out a donation form, you can do that as well. But yeah, thank you very much.